Thanks to lobbyists and the politicians who welcome them, there are few issues more contentious than climate change, despite the fact that scientists almost universally agree that the world is warming and human-produced carbon emissions are the primary cause. 84 years ago, before the cloud of disinformation polluted the field of discourse, an engineer and amateur climatologist published a paper in the Quarterly Journal of the Royal Meteorological Society entitled "The Artificial Production of Carbon Dioxide and Its Influence on Temperature." The author was Guy Callender, a second-generation British combustion and steam engineer who strayed out of his field to discover and name the most significant phenomenon that human society will likely ever face. So far, solutions to how the world will manage this challenge at the scale required have been elusive. Interestingly enough, another engineer has strayed from his field of expertise and trained himself in the field of economics to develop and propose just such a scalable solution. Dr. Delton Chen is a civil engineer and geohydrologist who stepped away from his career in 2013 to grapple with the huge question of climate disruption. The result is a policy idea called the Global Carbon Reward. It proposes to add a complementary economic system to our classically growth-oriented economy that would incentivize carbon mitigation through rewarding certifiable actions that sequester or remove carbon from the ecosystem. Dr. Chen bases his ideas on natural systems, and he achieves a synthesis of biomimicry and monetary policy to effect a solution that could initiate the intense global cooperation required. I want to thank Joshua Prieto of the Seeds of Tao podcast series for segments used in this interview related to what Dr. Chen calls a living systems economy. My show notes contain a link to that original interview. Now, let's meet Dr. Chen to get a sense of how his journey into the global carbon reward began.
This is really a story about me personally because I wasn't asked to do this. We could begin with my childhood, if you like, but I would just simply say I've always had a feeling that something is wrong in the way that humanity relates to nature and the environment. Since I have training in engineering, I also didn't want to take simply a reactionary response. I wanted to try and find some solutions that were deeper. And keeping in mind that much of my professional career was involved with mining, in the mining sector and resources. And that's not exactly sustainable. But I don't mean to sort of belittle that sector of the economy. It provides our energy. But I did make a conscious decision to get involved in projects that would be good for the climate. And so in 2007, I changed my career direction and joined a company that was developing a major geothermal project in Australia, in Central Australia. And that was probably the first conscious step I took towards working here. But after that project collapsed, I then went back to doing what I normally do. And in 2013, I had a personal life-changing moment, which allowed me to leave the work environment. And I traveled overseas. I traveled around the world. And I took that opportunity to begin thinking about a monetary solution to the financial problem of mitigating climate change. And to explain where it began, I really began with a hunch in 2013 that we could innovate a new currency to provide the scalable finance we need to pay people to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, which is quite a radical departure from the conventional idea of taxes, cap and trade, fee and dividend. So from a personal perspective, it was happening when I was traveling to Eastern Europe. I went to a conference in Istanbul that was hosted by Al Gore, Climate Reality. That was in 2013, I believe. And after that conference, I realized that I wasn't going to do something marginal or incremental. I wanted to do something major and use my knowledge and education. Festering in my mind was this idea of value. What does value mean at a most fundamental level? And the hunch that we could develop a currency, which is a pretty strange hunch, if you got to admit. And after traveling in Eastern Europe, I went to Central America, and I decided to use that time to sit down and try and figure out some kind of policy. And this is the first epiphany I had, if you want to call it that, or insight. It didn't take me long to figure out that you could actually fund climate mitigation without applying any taxation. And it would occur simply by transferring value from existing currencies into a new stateless reward/currency. So we create a new policy with different political dynamics. And I felt that this was important. I felt that it had potential to be useful. But what I didn't see in the literature was an explanation for this, and there weren't any policies of this type. So from 2013 onwards, I just got addicted to looking at this problem, asking people questions, figuring out the details. And around 2017, I really reached another major philosophical realization that what I was dealing with actually was a well-defined problem. And the problem is that we have two major objectives. One is managing the efficiency of the economy, and the other is managing the risks of climate change.
I want to take a moment to reintroduce the show. If you've just tuned in, this is KSQD Santa Cruz. I'm Christine Barrington for Talk of the Bay, and you are listening to Dr. Delton Chen about his journey to develop an economic policy innovation to address climate mitigation challenges. He calls it the Global Carbon Reward. While it is a monetary policy based on global currency exchanges, it has a deep philosophical underpinning. So let's return to Dr. Chen to hear more about the natural logic behind the global carbon reward.
In the conventional economic philosophy, economists focus on the first, which is economic efficiency, and they associate with that taxes. But the policy I'm developing says we have two distinct objectives, economic efficiency and climate certainty or safety, requiring two explicit prices on carbon, the first being a tax or stick, and the second being a reward or carrot. So I'm proposing carrots and sticks in a way that is formalized. And what is really challenging about this approach is that to explain this and to convince the scholars on this topic, I would need a fundamental argument to explain why we have this association between taxes and efficiency and rewards and climate safety. And the way I try to understand this problem is I ask the reverse question, why don't we swap them around? Why don't we use rewards for efficiency and taxes for climate safety? And there is no answer actually in standard economic theory. It's an unanswered question. It's a topic that isn't really being discussed or investigated. And so what was guiding me, my personal philosophy, was that I have a deep belief, call it a presumption or an assumption or a hypothesis, that the answers to these questions are so fundamental that they could only be found in the laws of nature. So I'm looking in the laws of nature for an explanation why we get this association between carrots and sticks and efficiency and safety. And since 2017, I've been racking my brains to try and figure out what's going on here. And I followed various lines of investigation until I found a model which I believe makes sense. And to cut a long story short, what we have, what's so new, is a scaling rule that explains not just the question about the economy and these prices on carbon, but it's a rule that's so general it appears to explain the thermodynamic properties of all complex living systems, including animals, plants, fungi, and potentially even unicellular organisms, as well as human economies. So this model theory, it has a couple different names. We might refer to it as the living systems economy. I was planning to begin explaining it with a metaphor. The metaphor explains the functions of our problem and solution. So the metaphor is a bicycle, and everyone knows a bicycle has a back wheel and a front wheel. So if we use the back wheel to visually represent the existing economy, the nature of the back wheel on a bicycle is to, in a sense, it's the powertrain for the bike. And what we like about the back wheel is when it's efficient. So pump up the tire, make it hard, make sure the gears are working and it's well oiled. And then if it's functioning well, we have an efficient economy. Now, carbon taxes in the original theory are supposed to improve that efficiency. So if we can accept that as our metaphor, then we can think about the front wheel. So the front wheel of a bicycle represents the functionality of what's missing in the world. I believe that we need another economy, which is represented by the front wheel, which has the role of keeping the rider safe. So the front wheel is based on this reward that I've been discussing, and it's actually a complementary economy based on a new monetary system. So if you think about a bicycle, the front wheel's connected to the handlebars, and the rider makes decisions about where to go. Like you wouldn't ride in front of a truck or something like that. You stay on a safe track. And so metaphorically, we see this balance between the front and back wheel to create a balanced system.
If you have just tuned in, this is KSQD Santa Cruz. I'm Christine Barrington for Talk of the Bay, and my subject is a bold economic policy proposal called the Global Carbon Reward that, if adopted, could shift the world's efforts to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions at the scale required to stabilize the biosphere. The originator of this idea is Dr. Delton Chen, and he is here explaining the philosophical basis for this idea. Dr. Chen connects it with ideas governing biomimicry, which is compelling. What better source is there to guide our choices around our planetary system than the system that evolved life in the first place? So let's get back to the show with Dr. Delton Chen on the Global Carbon Reward.
So the living systems economy, what I do to explain the solution is I actually make a comparison directly with plants, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to achieve here is carbon neutrality. Like we have to balance our carbon emissions with carbon sequestration and also reduce the emissions through whatever mechanisms we can, whatever technologies are available. The interesting thing is, if you look at living systems on Earth, they already can achieve carbon neutrality because plants respire and photosynthesize. Now, if you take a plant and you put it in a closed container with water and soil, a plant in that closed environment can survive for a very long time. There are examples where plants have survived in bottles for over 50 years. And so it's quite clear that plants do achieve carbon neutrality, but the question is why? And the answer is quite interesting. It's because there is this balance between respiration and photosynthesis, but the understanding is that you always need two systems, because a living system, generally speaking, cannot go in reverse. For example, if we had a kind of cell that photosynthesized, like chloroplast photosynthesizes, you wouldn't expect it to do the reverse by absorbing sugars and releasing light. So to cut a long story short, plants achieve carbon neutrality through the symbiosis of two distinct systems, which are both irreversible. Now, what the living systems economy does, it simply takes this model and applies it to our civilization with a kind of realization, if you like, that our existing economy, it is naturally attuned to efficiency, but it doesn't provide us with safety. Or in other words, our existing economy is macroscopically irreversible with respect to its carbon emissions. And the data from models and various analyses point to this finding. So as the human race, the human species, we'd be quite foolish to sit around waiting for economists and institutions to incrementally adjust our existing economy to achieve carbon neutrality in a safe climate, because this system is inherently not really structured for that purpose. And the analysis suggests that we need a new economy to complement it. The second economy, the front wheel of the bicycle. And thermodynamically, it plays the role of the chloroplast in the plant. So the concept that I'm trying to explain with the living systems economy is that we have to move away from a singular model, single ideas, and move to dualism and complementary economic thinking. So we have two objectives, not one objective. We have two economies, not one economy. This is how nature works. So coming back to the basics of biology, when you think about it, the Earth has evolved over millions of years to create an oxygenated atmosphere. And in an oxygenated atmosphere, the most efficient chemistry is wrapped around respiration and photosynthesis. And this is how most of the Earth's biology works. The irony here is that respiration, photosynthesis and plants are just right in front of our face. The trees outside, the grass, everything. And the funny thing is, we know respiration, photosynthesis are foundational to the Earth's biology. But for some funny reason, and it's a cognitive dissonance, we haven't figured out that that actually means something. We have a respiring economy. It's geared up and structured for that. It's not designed for the equivalent to photosynthesis. And a term that I'm using to explain this is very important. And this term is irreversibility or macroscopic irreversibility. What that means in this context is that if we think of our economy as a living system, and then we say, well, hold on, this economy is structured in a very specific way with the specific monetary system, banking, laws, regulations, infrastructure, the whole works, social expectations, consumerism. Everybody, wants to travel once a year to see relatives on the other side of the country and that type of thing. We know probabilistically this economy is not going to go carbon neutral anytime soon. There's no evidence to suggest it will. And so if we just take another step and say, well, hold on, this economy is macroscopically irreversible with respect to its carbon emissions, and we see this in nature, animals and fungi, they don't reverse their carbon balance. They always respire. And this economy will always respire as well. We could never go to zero emissions with this economy in a short time frame. It's so improbable. But if we say, hey, hold on, what nature does is it introduces another system, it always has, photosynthesis, and it balances out the respiration. And so if we follow that recipe, we then go to a new economy with its own specific monetary system, a unit of account based on so many kilograms of carbon with a service agreement, which would be mitigating 100 kilograms for 100 years. That's the service requirement. Then we impose contractual obligations on the projects that mitigate, and we fund them with this currency. And then the important understanding is we are biophysically mimicking, if you like, the natural laws that allow a complex living organism to achieve carbon neutrality. This is the essence of it, but I think it would be difficult to have this conversation with most economists. It's a bit out of the box, isn't it?
If you have just joined us and are wondering what this provocative idea around having a living systems economy is all about, the subject of the show today on KSQD is the Global Carbon Reward, a dramatic and powerful policy proposal put forward by Dr. Delton Chen. Dr. Chen's ideas made waves when famous sci-fi author Kim Stanley Robinson made it the central policy intervention that helps to restore the biosphere in his recent novel, The Ministry for the Future. After a short break, I'll be back with my interview with Dr. Delton Chen and more details about his Global Carbon Reward. There was an op-ed piece in the New York Times all the way back in 2018, and its headline stated, "Stopping climate change is hopeless. Let's do it." Preparing for this interview, I kept hearing those words in my mind. When you hear that headline, what comes up for you?
Well, I think that civilization is in a difficult position. I've always looked at this problem through the lens of finance. So I think that civilization is in a crisis. It's a crisis that will play out over decades and centuries. And the problem we have is a crisis of human cooperation primarily, which is tied to finance and scalable finance so that we can cooperate. That to me is close to the center of this problem. And I think that if we are to solve this problem, we might need a new philosophy for how to manage our economy.
So you're looking at it through the lens of very grounded reality of market forces, fiscal policy, monetary policy, but there's also a philosophical underpinning, which is kind of true of all our systems, right? They all have some kind of philosophical underpinning.
Yes, economics and engineering, science generally is based on philosophy, and that philosophy usually stems back to logic and physics at some point. Now, for climate change, once again, I think that the way we're trying to tackle this problem is being biased by, in a sense, our optimism and pessimism over different issues. I tend to see that we're a bit pessimistic about our technological capacity, given that we have decades to respond, but we're a bit optimistic in our behavioural capacity, in that we're not really thinking about what does it take for human beings to mobilise in an exponential capacity for this crisis. And if we just assume carbon taxes or some regular policy is going to be sufficient, I think that's being very optimistic about human behaviour. And we have to find that right combination of policies that can unlock human behaviour to respond appropriately.
Well, let's jump to that. You have mentioned the word cooperation. And as I have listened to you on podcast and read your writings, I noticed that you emphasize mechanisms that will increase cooperation, not through moralizing and stating this is the right thing to do. Instead, you are suggesting that we institute a policy that creates pressures and incentives for cooperation. And one of these pressures is something that you refer to as the carrot and the stick. The dynamic of carbon rewards plus carbon taxes or fees working in tandem. The other way that you've stated that cooperation would be enhanced is through carbon quantitative easing, which you assert is different than conventional quantitative easing. So I want to first talk about the carrot and the stick because that's easier to talk about. What do you mean when you say that?
Well, carrots and sticks are ubiquitous. There have been scientifically controlled studies to determine how cooperation is impacted by different combinations of carrots and sticks. And the results are really very interesting because the finding is that to maximize cooperation in competitive games, a combination of carrots and sticks is significantly better. And indeed, beginning with carrots and then following up with sticks appears to be the optimum. Ironically, when it comes to climate change, we're doing the opposite. We're using mainly sticks and we're not focusing on carrots. In the United States, the Inflation Act that was recently introduced by the Biden administration is a good example of a carrot. So that is a kind of carrot that is fiscally based. In other words, it's funded through the government's budget, however they intend to manage that. It is not a monetary policy per se, and that's the differentiation here. The carrot that I'm putting forward is going to be funded by monetary policy, hence the reference to quantitative easing or QE. So QE is a word that I think triggers negative connotations nowadays. However, it doesn't have to be negative. It just depends on how it's designed.
So, all right, considering that all central banks are given mandates by their governments, why would they do this? Pundits I've listened to insist that they would not, or that it would be so unlikely as to undermine even the possibility of the global carbon reward. Can you speak to this?
Sure. Now, what we're talking about here are people's forecasting for a political reaction, a political response. With central banks, possibly not the Federal Reserve because that is a private consortium, but just generally central banks, their mandates are not self-defined. They don't create their own mandates. The mandates are given to them. So we have to ask the question differently. Will government give their central banks new mandates explicitly for supporting a global carbon reward? And that is more of a question of law. Can it happen? Well, historically, changes to monetary systems have been very rapid. When the decision is made, it usually is executed pretty quickly. Examples are Bretton Woods. Those conferences were wrapped up in the matter of weeks. We might say, well, that's a special case. Yes, it is, because it was the end of World War II, or leading up to the end of World War II. The end of the gold standard happened in maybe 10 minutes when the then President Nixon announced it on radio. So that was very fast. What I'm saying is that when decisions are made and the realization is there, the elites in the system can implement new mandates quite rapidly. There may be legal details. For example, the European Union has its own legal framework. It tends to be pro-environment and pro-climate with central banking. A very good example, actually, is the Bank of England. It was just last year the Exchequer wrote a letter to the Bank of England saying, you now should be targeting net zero. So that letter was sent without any real, open public debate or discussion, and that might be an example of just how quickly this can happen. The question is, what are the details? What are the actual policies? So if we find that we can actually prove the case that we need a carbon exchange standard, the people in the central bank community, their regulators, they're well-educated people. They're economists, primarily policymakers. They understand maths and economics. If we present a logical argument, we could probably convince a few countries to pilot a carbon currency. Once it's piloted, it can then be discussed under the UN FCCC, and the rest is history. It's not for me to guess whether central banks will like it or not. I think the only way we'll find out is to put it to them. And if a lot of people in the general public support it, that will probably help a lot.
Well, that's what this interview series is all about, stoking interest so that the general public will investigate further and decide for themselves if the global carbon reward describes a path forward for the climate that they can get behind. And in case you have just tuned in, this is KSQD Santa Cruz, and I'm Christine Barrington. My guest is Dr. Delton Chen, founder of the Global Carbon Reward, a policy proposal that enlists the power of the central banks to create a carbon currency for the purpose of rewarding and funding carbon mitigation. So with that in mind, let's dig a little deeper. In March of this year, the Wall Street Journal published an article about the global carbon reward entitled, "Could a Carbon Coin Save the Planet?" Kim Stanley Robinson, in his amazing work of fiction called The Ministry of the Future, also referred to your policy proposal as a carbon coin. Is this an accurate way to understand the global carbon reward?
Good question. In the novel by Robinson, it's called Carbon Coin, and my name is used in the novel in reference. However, we call it a carbon currency for the reason that the term coin is often associated with cryptocurrencies. What makes this instrument so unique is that, one, it's not a cryptocurrency. Two, it's not a carbon credit, so it does not transfer ownership of carbon and you can't use it to offset carbon emissions. And that's very important because what that implies is that the carbon currency will be fully funded and we won't have to rely on offsetting markets, meaning that we can retire all the carbon, and it creates a much safer outcome. And the third thing is it's not money like you would use to go shopping. It's called a carbon currency, but you can't buy things with it. It's really just an asset to create a price signal and for people to invest in, and to make sure that scalable finance with the currency is going to the projects and the businesses that are doing the heavy lifting, doing the carbon removal, the deep decarbonisation, and replacing fossil fuels with renewable and cleaner sources of energy.
Thank you for stating so clearly that this is not a cryptocurrency, because most people assume that somehow it is. And I think that's probably because most folks don't understand cryptocurrency. So when they hear anything novel related to the word currency, that's where they go. What I understand so far is that it is a standard currency like gold or silver, except that its value is created by how much carbon has been removed from the atmosphere, and you call that the carbon standard. Which brings us to the question of how the value of that carbon is determined. How does one price nature?
Christine, they're related, but how to price nature is a much deeper question, and indeed a conundrum, I believe, for economists and philosophers. Now, the point here is that there is a kind of, I think, inner desire in many people to figure out how to price nature, because a part of us really wants to protect it, and we feel that we're not putting enough value on nature. At least that's the way I feel. I think maybe many people in the audience might feel in a similar way. And so people have proposed many different policies and ideas for pricing nature differently. One example is natural capital, which is quite popular actually amongst financial people in banking and so on. It's a code and a standard, if you like, natural capital, which means trying to put a monetary value on ecosystem services from landscapes. It could be water runoff and fresh air and amenity like that. Now, my point is that, one, carbon is the building block of life. So if we're going to price carbon, we should be cognizant of the fact that we're dealing with the building block of life, and it plays a fundamental role in the entire biosphere, including it holds the information that we know as DNA. So carbon is the holder of information of DNA. It is the building block as well of life, and it mediates energy flows. Now, let's come back to natural capital. Is that the way to price nature? And what I claim is that it's one way, but it's not sufficient. What I claim is that we need two ways to price nature to be complete. The difference here is that natural capital, it sets a zero datum of zero value to start with, and you go up. So how much is nature worth in this area? Oh, let's say it's worth $10 million. So you go up from $0 to 10 million. That datum is socially framed because money is a socially framed construct. The way the global carbon reward is pricing nature, so to speak, is the opposite. What we do is we look at nature and say, what is the physical metric that describes reasonably well the health of the entire biosphere? And the answer would be the temperature. Or it could be parts per million of CO2. Or it could be the carbon budget. What these are physical datums. Now, a physical datum is not the same as a social datum, is it? Because it's physical. And you're looking directly at the quality of the environment. So we set our physical datum. Let's say it's 400 parts per million of CO2. And then we ask ourselves, how much will it cost us to defend that physical datum? And that's what the global carbon reward is doing. So it is very different, and it's a different way of pricing nature. However, I'd also say one more thing, and that is neither of these approaches can truly price nature. What we're doing is combining two complementary ways to price nature. The first is anthropocentric, that's natural capital. The second is systemic. This is where we assign and defend a physical condition, and then we offer the reward to pay to protect that physical condition. It's this combination of anthropocentric and systemic creates complementary relationships, which will, I believe, protect civilization and stabilize the biosphere. However, at a very, very deep level, both have elements of anthropocentrism and both have elements of systemic understanding, but they're different contexts. And that's why this problem is so challenging. We haven't yet figured out the complementary nature of pricing. So if I'm right about this, this is another reason why we need the carbon currency, because the role of the carbon currency is to defend the carbon budget, to protect the biosphere, the complementary pricing. Now, when you think of it in those terms, everything begins to fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, because we're introducing another currency type, and it holds a new context for value, a new relationship to valuing nature, but noting that you cannot actually price nature no matter what you do, because that, I think, is just impossible.
You know, I really appreciate the willingness to acknowledge the impossibility of putting a price on nature. While I can see that it's a necessary discussion, it still feels kind of ridiculous to think that we can price nature. I think it's potent, however, to imagine demonstrating our respect and need for a healthy biosphere with an economic mechanism that's explicitly dedicated to that purpose. I love it. And so, speaking of pricing nature, there is a podcast out of Yale dedicated to just this topic, and it's called, not surprisingly, Pricing Nature. They dedicated 2 of their shows to examining the global carbon reward, and one of their commentators called this policy an incredibly inefficient way to raise vast sums of revenue. So what I'm wondering is this: what is an efficient way to do that?
The way standard economics works is to maximize or optimize the efficiency of markets. Because that theory and philosophy is so convincing and powerful, it is the dominant philosophy of economics today. You can see this in the narratives of various people, including the discussants in that interview. And the point is that it's true, efficiencies are good for society because we don't want to waste materials and waste energy. However, the point I make is that a complex living system that deals with its carbon balance cannot necessarily exist or survive purely on efficiency optimization. And this should become apparent as we look more closely at the carbon balance itself. So, for example, a major part of our global carbon budget into the future will involve taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So taking carbon out of the atmosphere at the order of, say, 3, 4 to 10 gigatons per annum is a huge undertaking. It's like burning fossil fuels in reverse. In fact, that's a good analogy because if you're going to take carbon out of the atmosphere, it will likely require large amounts of energy because of the thermodynamics. Now, this energy we use to take carbon out of the atmosphere, it's gone. Like once it's used for that purpose, you can't use the energy for something else, such as producing goods and services. And this is the key point. As a civilization, we've been using energy to produce goods and services that we enjoy, things that are practical in the moment, such as food, fiber for clothing, transportation, heating in homes, manufacturing, all those things. But taking carbon out of the atmosphere is not directly a good or service for human beings because the benefits are essentially invisible. The benefits are for the whole planetary climate as a giant common pool resource. Now, the point here is that when you get into carbon removal at such scale, it's going to require a trade-off with your goods and services because you're reallocating resources to new activity, right? The carbon removal. That means we're going to become less productive in the conventional sense. And there you have a decrease in efficiency. So here, when you look at the problem through the lens of the carbon balance and the energy requirements, we should begin to realize that we have to become inefficient to be able to balance our global carbon budget. Inefficient within the historical framing of goods and services and productivity. But inefficiency is not regarded as being useful in standard economics. But inefficiency is actually needed for a different reason, and it's for risk management. So whenever you have a high-risk problem, a systemically risky problem, there is usually or often a trade-off with efficiency. And this is what's missing in the standard model, the standard economic theory for the climate problem, in my opinion. So I'll give our listeners an example. Remember COVID-19, the pandemic? Obviously we do. Remember what governments did in response? They introduced social lockdown. That was hugely inefficient, right? Massive loss in efficiency. But why? To manage the systemic risk, because there was a panic. The panic was, whatever the disease was, the virus, it would spread exponentially and overwhelm the the healthcare system. And who knows what else could happen? Maybe society would become really dysfunctional. So there was a sacrifice of efficiency to manage systemic risk. And this is not that unusual. It happens, quite often when you think about it. Wartime is another example. So it quite clearly cannot be the case that humanity manages all problems purely through efficiency. So what efficiency means is being able to predict into the future the costs of climate change and the benefits of applying a tax to mitigate climate change. So it's saying implicitly that the economists have the capability to see for decades into the future, to the end of the century, what this is all going to cost and what all the economic benefits are. But there lies your problem. They can't do that. The data are too uncertain and there are too many variables. Also, their computer models presume predictability. In other words, computer models for economists cannot predict if there's going to be a war between major superpowers. They can't predict if there's going to be a pandemic. They can't predict lots of things. They're assuming it's possible to make these predictions. There is another problem too with them implicitly, and that's time discounting. They have to time discount, and those discount factors are entirely subjective. This is why leading economists have been debating the ideal carbon tax for decades, because of these uncertainties and subjective features of predicting or estimating efficiency. What's the solution? The solution is obvious to me. The solution is based on the understanding that climate change is a dynamic problem that has to be managed as a risk-based problem and not just an efficiency problem. Ironically, the Paris Climate Agreement does exactly that. The Paris Agreement is a risk-based objective. It says it in Article 2, stay under 1.5 to 2 degrees to limit the risks and impacts of climate change. It does not say to maximize the efficiency of markets. That's not the objective. Why? Because the politicians and the scientists realized this is a very complex problem. And if we go over 2 degrees of global warming, suddenly all of these risk factors multiply and become nonlinear in all domains of human experience, in economies, for people in Africa who have to survive off the land, impacts on ecosystems, extreme weather. Everything starts to go red, flashing red, danger, danger. So that's why we're trying to stay under 2 degrees.
I'm sure anyone listening to you right now has this phrase going through their mind. So where's the money going to come from? How is that going to happen? And so let's set the stage. My understanding is our global GDP is about $100 trillion. And to deal with climate change, if we could start really dealing with it today, it would take $2 to $3 trillion year in, year out for a long time. Okay, so that's 2 to 3% of global GDP. In my mind, that sounds doable, but where's the money going to come from? Can you explain that in a way that we can understand?
Sure, I'll try. To answer this question, we have to actually understand the monetary system. And this is not easy to understand. It's a bit of a mystery, actually. The way I understand the monetary system is that when governments are budgeting, we tend to look at this issue the way we budget money at home. So we have a finite amount of money coming in and a finite amount going out, and the difference is what's left in your bank account. So for governments, it's a bit like that too, but that's not actually the way the whole economy works. Money is being created and destroyed all the time. So we don't have the right to do that as consumers, as citizens, but commercial banks do. And indeed, that's how the money is created, through commercial banking. It's created as loans and destroyed when loans are paid off. Keeping that in mind, we then need to understand that we can manage the money supply to our advantage because it's a dynamic supply. It always is dynamic. That's why we have financial crises, actually. People stop spending because they're afraid of the future. Businesses aren't borrowing. And what happens? There's less money in circulation. That's a major factor. So what we're going to do then with this policy is have all the central banks promise or guarantee to buy our carbon currency on a schedule where the exchange rate will be rising for decades to meet our climate target. And because that means the value of our currency is rising, the guarantee will attract investors in the private sector. So institutions and citizens will be buying the carbon currency. Thus, we're actually paying for the mitigation with private investment. And the central bank guarantee, which is going to use money printing, or QE if you like, is the backstop. It's the underwriting or the guarantee of this financial asset. The value of the carbon currency must rise to meet our need for more and more carbon removal from the atmosphere and conventional mitigation. However, sometime later this century, the value of the carbon currency would peak and it could fall and then stabilize. That introduces quite a lot more complexity. However, to understand the implications, we have to go deeper into the money supply question and much deeper into the future, because in the future, the situation won't look anything like today. Well, it'll be very different, I should say, because climate impacts will be much more severe. Inflation on goods and services will be much higher because of extreme weather events. There'll be 10 billion people potentially needing to be fed. Water supply will be stressed because of droughts and floods, hurricanes. There'll be more fires. Everything will be chaotic. In that environment, we can't use today's thinking about inflation. We have to project ourselves into a future. And in that future, people there will be worrying about real inflation, CPI inflation, not monetary inflation. So we want to use the monetary inflation to counteract the impacts of climate change. And in the future, if there's too much money being created because of the QE, the central bank purchases of the carbon currency, then we just take money out of supply using conventional policy.
Thank you for bringing up the dreaded I word, inflation. It's great to know that you are also considering this issue seriously. However, right now, I want to pivot and touch on your potential next steps. No one is going to entertain this policy idea if there isn't some solid way to offer proof of concept. You have spoken of a demonstration. What is that about?
So our plan is to demonstrate the policy without a carbon currency. That might be surprising. You'd think we'd be building one, but no. What's really important is not the currency. What's important is how the policy affects decision making. So what we want to do is create a kind of simulated policy, and we interview decision makers in businesses, in industry, in companies, and put it to them, what's your decision if we offer you this reward? We do the number crunching in some spreadsheets. We look at the amount of carbon that can be mitigated and the financial benefits over time. Look at the contract, the service level agreement, and find out whether these decision makers like the policy and whether or not it would influence them. So we're talking about, major industries. We can go to the shipping industry. We can go to aviation. We can go to the fossil fuel sector. Because at the end of the day, we've got to stop the fossil fuel companies from extracting coal, oil, and natural gas, particularly from greenfield sites. So the IEA, the International Energy Association, has said that we can't mine these greenfield sites. It'll blow the carbon budget. So if we come into these greenfield sites and we offer the reward not to mine, we can also have conditions that the carbon currency we offer them, which would be roughly equivalent to the profit margin on those resources, Our condition is you have to reinvest that into strategic renewable energy infrastructure, clean energy infrastructure. So our policy has the potential to flip the coin on these greenfield sites. Instead of mining them, we convert the whole resource into a renewable energy play. There are examples of this. Ecuador had advertised for people to buy their fossil fuel resources so they didn't have to mine Isuni National Park, highly biodiverse rainforest areas. And that's essentially what we could do, but in a more orderly and formal way to manage the global energy system and to do it in a way that selects the appropriate places to offer the reward and to help in developing countries with their energy infrastructure.
So this demonstration would involve a lot of manpower and interviewing, but no actual currency. Okay, that's great because, again, in the discussions that I have with people about the global carbon reward, there's always concern that a demonstration involving a real currency seemed pretty impossible to achieve.
Exactly, Christine. And we call it role playing. We'll role play the policy, and it would be fantastic to base this demonstration in California. And the reason is that California as an economy and the state government there would have tremendous reach around the world. So to base it there, we could have some of these role-playing interviews with businesses in California, and then we can also expand it to other countries. And that would be just a brilliant way to organize it.
It's a great idea. As Jimmy Carter once famously said, unfortunately, trends that start in California have a tendency to spread. So, considering this, what's the reality around achieving this demonstration?
Yes, we have our strategic plan for explaining the whole project. We've budgeted the work. It will take place over 3 years approximately in stages. So the total cost we estimate is $6.5 million for a very intense and fast-track program, because we understand that time is of the essence. To get things going, we estimate we need about $300,000 just for this early planning stage to bridge us into finding the major sponsors for the rest of the $6.5 million. And as soon as we get some of that money, we can start. We could start organising, finding the businesses to do the role playing. We also hire economists to do, the more technical economic assessments and doing the video work. And also part of the demonstration is finding experts in banking, central banking and policy, and interviewing them, because we want to know what they think. What do the central bankers actually think about this? And we'd have to explain it to them well, because the questions that we've discussed, such as inflation, the limits to growth, the supply of debt-based money versus debt-free money, and so on, all these issues are really very sophisticated, and they have to be presented in a cohesive way. And we're very interested in what central bankers and policymakers think about this.
Delton, thank you so much for taking the time to explain some of the details of what is a complex policy for a complex problem. There is a growing body of individuals who think the global carbon reward could be a tipping point policy to move us towards ecosystem balance, and some of those people have invited you to Santa Cruz on November 2nd for an event at the Resource Center for Nonviolence. We look forward to seeing you then.
Awesome. I look forward to being there, and thank you so much for the interview. Bye for now.
Dr. Delton Chen is on a bicoastal tour to engage conversation and interest around the global carbon reward. He will be presenting along with Kim Stanley Robinson at the Verge Climate Tech Summit in San Jose on October 26th. And join him in Santa Cruz on November 2nd for an event entitled Funding for the Future: New Ways to Value Life on Our Planet. Information and registration can be found in our show notes at ksqd.org and on Eventbrite. Again, it is called Funding for the Future. I'm Christine Barrington for Talk at the Bay. Look for my next interview on the global carbon reward Monday, October 31st on KSQD, your community radio station for the Central Coast.